The floor beneath me cracked as the entire palace shook, and I grabbed the throne's armrest so hard my knuckles turned pale blue. Alarms screamed through the corridors outside, but nobody in this room moved to answer them. That was the strange part. My father's guards stood frozen, staring at the wall screen instead of running toward the noise, because the noise did not matter anymore. What mattered was the image glowing above us, 12 feet tall, replaying itself for the third time since I had entered the room. A single human, standing in the wreckage of a bunker, reloading a weapon with hands that did not shake. "Seraphil," my father said, without turning to look at me. "Come closer. You need to see this before I tell you what I have decided." I did not want to come closer. Something about the way the human moved on that screen made my chest tighten, though he wasn't even doing anything violent in that particular moment. He was calm. That was all. Just calm, in a place where calm made no sense at all. 3 of our warships hovered above that battlefield in the recording, their shadows falling over the rubble like slow-moving clouds. Any reasonable soldier, alien or otherwise, would have been sprinting for cover, or surrendering, or at the very least, showing some sign of fear on his face. This human did none of that. He crouched beside a fallen soldier, checked for injuries with 2 fingers against the neck, and kept working like the ships above him were nothing more than passing weather. He disabled our jamming array with his bare hands, 20 minutes before this recording, my father said. Not with a device, not with a weapon designed for it, with wire cutters and patience. Our ships lost contact with command for 6 minutes. 6 minutes was enough. I finally forced myself to step down from the side platform and stand beside him, staring up at the frozen image of the man's face. He did not look like the monster the broadcasts had always described. He looked tired, almost bored, like a man doing a chore he had done 100 times before and would do 100 times again without complaint. Enough for what? I asked, though some small, cold part of me already suspected the answer. Enough for the ceasefire to hold instead of collapsing into another 8 years of war, my father said. Enough for the treaty we are about to sign. Enough, Seraphil, for me to decide that this is the man you will marry. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The great hall of Calith Palace had perfect acoustics, built specifically so that no whisper could be misunderstood by accident, so I knew I had heard him correctly. I simply refused to believe it. "You're joking," I said. "I have never joked about an alliance in my life." "Father, that is Sergeant Marcus Cole. That is the human they call the Quiet Storm across 4 systems. That is the soldier whose name alone made 3 of our fleet commanders request early retirement rather than face him again." My voice climbed higher with every word, and I did nothing to stop it. "You want me to marry him?" "I want peace," my father said simply, "and peace, this time, wears a human face." I turned back to the screen, to that frozen image of calm violence, of a man who moved through catastrophe like it was simply Tuesday. Every instinct in my body told me to run from that image, not walk toward it, and certainly not spend the rest of my life standing beside it. "Not him, Father," I said, and I heard my own voice crack on the word him. "I'm terrified of that human warrior. I expected him to soften. I expected some fatherly reassurance, some promise that the arrangement was only political, that I would never actually have to stand close to a man capable of what I had just watched. Instead, my father turned to face me fully for the first time since I had entered the room, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen there before. Not anger, not disappointment. Respect, aimed in a direction I did not want it aimed. "Good," he said quietly. "That means you finally understand what we are dealing with." The words landed harder than the tremors still rattling the windows. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation, waiting for him to take it back, but he only turned away and gestured for the recording to end. The screen went dark, and the room felt strangely emptier without that terrible calm face staring down at us. "You misunderstand fear, Seraphil," he continued, walking slowly toward the balcony that overlooked our capital city. Smoke still rose from 3 districts in the distance, remnants of a war none of us had expected to survive, let alone lose ground in. For 300 years, Every species we have ever fought has behaved according to the same rules. Calculate the odds. Retreat when the odds turn bad. Preserve the many by sacrificing the few. It's not cruelty, it's simply how war works. It's how war has always worked, for every civilized species in this galaxy. And the humans don't follow those rules, I said, because I had heard this lecture in pieces before, from tutors, from generals, from frightened whispers among the palace staff. The humans don't seem to know there are rules to follow, my father said. Our neural pacification fields were designed to keep soldiers calm under fire, to prevent panic, to prevent unnecessary cruelty. Every species we have ever encountered responds to them. Humans do not. We do not understand why. Our scientists have 3 competing theories and no proof for any of them. So they're immune to being controlled, I said. That sounds like something to fear, not something to reward with a wedding. They are immune to being predictable, my father corrected me. That is worse. An enemy who panics can be exploited. An enemy who calculates can be outcalculated. An enemy who simply refuses to stop, no matter what the numbers say, cannot be managed by any method we have ever developed. Sergeant Cole did not defeat 3 warships that day because he was strong. He defeated them because he never once considered that he might lose, and so he never gave our forces the one thing every battle plan depends on, a moment where the enemy breaks. I looked past my father, out at the smoke still curling into the evening sky, and felt something heavier than fear settle into my stomach. If this was true, if this calm, tired-looking man truly did not break, then perhaps my father was right to be more afraid of his silence than of any war cry. That did not make the idea of marrying him feel any less impossible. There must be another way to secure the treaty, I said. Trade agreements, territory concessions, anything other than handing your daughter over to the very thing you claim to fear. My father's expression softened, just slightly, and for a moment I saw not the emperor, but simply my father, tired from years of a war he had never wanted. I am not handing you over, Sarathiel. I am asking you to stand beside the one force in this galaxy, capable of ending wars before they start, rather than after they have already cost us everything. If this alliance holds, no empire will dare test us again, human or otherwise. But I understand your fear. I felt it too, the first time I watched that recording. Then why does it not stop you? Because a good ruler does not let fear choose for her, he said. Only understanding does that, and you do not understand this man yet. You only understand the myth built around him. I wanted to argue further, to list every horror story whispered through the palace corridors about human soldiers who fought through injuries that should have ended them, who kept advancing when every alien unit around them had already retreated, who seemed to feel no instinct for self-preservation at all. But the look on my father's face told me the decision had already been made long before I entered this room. My protest was a formality, nothing more. When do I meet him? I asked, because there was no point asking whether I had to. 3 days from now, my father said, aboard the neutral station between our territories. Ambassadors from both sides will be present. It will be a controlled environment, Sarathiel, perfectly safe. You said that about the ceasefire negotiations too, I reminded him. And I watched a man disable an entire fleet's communications using wire cutters. My father almost smiled at that, though he stopped himself before it fully formed. Fair point, he admitted. Pack lightly. And Sarathiel, one more thing. I turned back toward him at the doorway, my hand already resting against the cool metal frame. Do not judge him by that recording alone, my father said. A man's worst day rarely tells you who he is. It only tells you what he is capable of when everything else has already been taken from him. I did not understand what he meant by that. Not fully, not yet. I only knew that 3 days from now I would be standing in the same room as the quiet storm. The human soldier whose calm had somehow become more terrifying to our entire empire than any scream of rage could ever be. That night, I lay awake in my quarters, replaying the recording in my mind, even though the screen had long since gone dark. I kept seeing his hands, steady over the fallen soldier, steady over the wire cutters, steady in a way that made no sense against a backdrop of collapsing walls and hovering warships. I tried to imagine those same hands reaching toward me during a wedding ceremony, and my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. 3 days, I told myself. 3 days until I stood face to face with the thing that had made an entire empire finally consider fear a form of wisdom. I did not sleep well. I do not think anyone in the palace did. By morning, the transport ship was already being prepared on the launch platform outside my window, its hull gleaming under the pale light of our twin suns. Servants moved through my quarters gathering belongings I barely registered, folding garments I would apparently need for a wedding I had never asked for, to a man I had only ever seen through the cold distance of a recorded screen. I stood at the window and watched the smoke from the distant districts finally begin to clear, thin gray ribbons dissolving into a sky that seemed almost too calm for everything that had happened. Perhaps that was the lesson my father wanted me to learn before I even left the palace. Sometimes the most dangerous things in this galaxy did not announce themselves with fire or fury. Sometimes they simply waited, patient and quiet, until the moment mattered most. I did not know it yet, but I was about to learn exactly how right my father was, and exactly how wrong I had been about everything I thought I understood about fear. The neutral station smelled like nothing at all, which somehow made it worse. No perfume of home, no scent of familiar gardens, only the flat recycled air of a place built to belong to no one and everyone at once. My boots echoed against the polished floor as my guards walked ahead of me, their weapons holstered, but their hands never far from them, and I noticed something odd before we had even reached the meeting chamber. They kept glancing behind us, not toward any threat, toward the empty corridor itself, as though something might appear there without warning. "Is everything prepared?" I asked the lead guard, a broad-shouldered officer named Kestor, who had served my family since before I was born. "The human delegation arrived 2 hours ago, Princess," Kestor said. His voice was tight, in a way I had never heard from him before, not even during the worst days of the war. "Sergeant Cole is already in the meeting chamber. Alone." "Alone," I repeated. Why would he wait alone? He said he did not want to make anyone uncomfortable by bringing armed escorts into a room meant for peace talks, Kestor said, and the way he said it made it sound less like courtesy and more like a threat wrapped in politeness. "He is unarmed, Princess." We checked, twice. I did not find that reassuring in the slightest. An unarmed human who had once disabled an entire fleet's communications with wire cutters did not strike me as any less dangerous than an armed one. If anything, it confirmed exactly what my father had told me. This man did not need weapons to be the most concerning presence in any room he entered. The chamber doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I stepped inside expecting to feel my chest tighten the way it had while watching that recording. Instead, I found myself staring at something almost absurdly ordinary. A man sat at the long meeting table, both hands wrapped around a cup of something steaming, staring into it like he was trying to decide whether it was actually coffee or a clever imitation of it. He looked up when the doors opened, and the first thing I noticed was how tired his eyes seemed. Not cruel, not calculating, simply tired in the way of someone who had not slept properly in longer than he cared to admit. He stood the moment he saw me enter, setting the cup down carefully so it would not spill, and something about the simple courtesy of that gesture confused me more than any display of strength could have. "PrincessHFY," he said, his translated voice carrying an accent our systems could not fully smooth away, something rough around the edges of certain vowels. "I'm Marcus Cole. It's good to finally meet you." I did not answer right away. I was too busy studying him, searching for some sign of the monster from the recording, some hint of the calm violence that had made 3 fleet commanders request early retirement. I found none of it. I found a man in his early 30s, dressed in a simple gray uniform without a single decoration or medal pinned to it, standing patiently while I decided whether or not to speak. "You may sit," I finally said, because it seemed like the sort of thing a princess should say. even though we both knew I had no real authority in this borrowed room. "Thank you," he said, and sat back down, though he waited until I had taken my own seat first. Kestor and the rest of my guards remained standing near the door, and I noticed again how carefully they positioned themselves, never fully turning their backs to the human, even though he had made no move that could be considered threatening. I understood their caution. I simply did not yet understand whether it was justified. "I imagine you've seen the footage," Marcus said, and there was no pride in his voice when he said it, only a kind of weary acknowledgement. "Everyone does, before these meetings. I've stopped expecting anything else." "I have seen it," I admitted, "several times." "Then you probably think I'm going to be difficult to sit across from," he said, and something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I get that a lot." "Should I not think that?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Marcus considered the question for a long moment, turning his cup slightly on the table before answering. "I think you should think whatever keeps you comfortable in this room," he said. "But I also think it might help to know that day wasn't a victory for me. It was the day I lost 11 people I'd trained with for 3 years. I wasn't calm because I didn't care what happened. I was calm because falling apart wouldn't have brought a single one of them back." I had not expected that answer. I had expected justification, perhaps even quiet pride disguised as humility. Instead, I found myself staring at a man who spoke about the worst day of his life, the way one might describe a bruise that had never fully healed. "Our reports describe that day as your greatest triumph," I said carefully. "Your reports are wrong," Marcus said, without any anger in his voice, only correction, the way one might point out a simple error in a ledger. "Or maybe they're right, depending on how you measure triumph. We held the position, we got the wounded out. I just don't think anyone should call that a good day." One of my advisors, a narrow-faced diplomat named Oren Thale, leaned forward from his seat at the far end of the table and spoke in clipped, translated Galactic that carried an unmistakable edge of contempt. "Perhaps the sergeant would prefer we describe his actions more accurately then," Oren said, "as the destruction of an entire coordinated assault, achieved through methods that violated 17 separate conventions of honorable engagement." I expected Marcus to react. I expected his jaw to tighten, his shoulders to square. Some flicker of the temper the recordings had promised us existed beneath that calm surface. Instead, he simply nodded, as though considering the accusation on its own merits. "You're not wrong about the conventions," Marcus said. "We don't have the same conventions you do. I won't pretend otherwise, but I'd rather violate 17 conventions and bring my people home than follow every rule perfectly and bury them instead." Oren's mouth opened to respond, but my father's chief negotiator, seated beside him, placed a firm hand on his arm and gave a small shake of the head. Whatever tension existed in that room, it seemed the negotiators on both sides had been warned not to let it boil over before the treaty was finalized. I studied Marcus more closely after that exchange, searching for the anger that should have followed such an insult, the pride that should have followed such a victory. I found neither. What I found instead was a stillness that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than simple discipline, the kind of calm that only exists in people who have already survived the worst thing they can imagine and found nothing left to fear on the other side of it. That realization frightened me more than the recording ever had. A monster who hid rage behind a calm mask could still be understood, still be predicted, still be managed the way my father's advisors managed every other threat in this galaxy. But a man who had genuinely emptied himself of rage, who spoke about tragedy with the plain honesty of someone describing weather, offered nothing for anyone to grab hold of. There was no lever to pull, no fear to exploit, no pride to wound. For the first time, I understood exactly what my father meant when he said humans could not be managed. "Princess," Marcus said, drawing my attention back to him, and I realized I had been staring for longer than was polite. "You've been quiet. Is everything all right?" The question surprised me. Nobody in this room, human or alien, had asked after my comfort since I arrived. Every conversation so far had revolved around treaties, conventions, alliances, and fear. Nobody had simply asked how I was doing. "I am attempting to understand you," I admitted, because there seemed little point in pretending otherwise, with a man who had already been so plain about his own grief. "Everything I have been told about your people suggests I should be afraid of you." "Are you?" he asked, and there was no challenge in the question, only genuine curiosity. "Yes," I said honestly, though perhaps not for the reasons my advisors expect. Marcus nodded slowly, as though that answer satisfied something he had been wondering since I walked in. "Can I ask what those reasons are?" he said. "I'd rather understand the actual problem than guess at it." I hesitated, aware that Oren and Kester were both watching me closely, aware that whatever I said next would likely be reported back to my father before the day ended. But something about the quiet patience in Marcus's expression made me want to answer honestly, regardless of who might be listening. "You are not afraid of anything," I said. "Not our fleets, not our conventions, not even the insults thrown at you across this table. My father says that makes you the most dangerous thing in this galaxy, because nobody knows how to predict a man who has nothing left to protect." Something shifted in Marcus's expression then, subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I saw a crack in that impossible calm. Not anger, something closer to sorrow. "Your father's half right," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not afraid of most things anymore. But it's not because I have nothing left to protect, Princess. It's because I already know exactly what happens when I fail to protect the people I care about, and I've decided I'd rather live through that grief again than let fear talk me into leaving someone behind. That's not the absence of fear. That's just what's left after fear stops being useful." The room went quiet after that, quieter than it had been since I first stepped through the doors, and I found myself unable to look away from him. "That does not sound like the absence of fear," I said slowly. "That sounds like something worse." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "I've had people tell me that before. My old commanding officer used to say I traded fear for something more dangerous, the day I stopped flinching." I never disagreed with her. Ambassador Henry Ashcroft, the human diplomat seated beside Marcus, cleared his throat gently, glancing between us with the careful expression of a man trying to steer a conversation back towards safer waters. "Perhaps we should return to the terms of the treaty," Henry suggested. "There are still several articles requiring both parties' approval before the ceremony can proceed." I nodded, grateful for the interruption, even as some smaller part of me wished the conversation had continued. As the negotiators resumed their formal discussion, exchanging clauses and provisions in careful diplomatic language, I found my attention repeatedly drifting back to the man across the table, watching the way he listened, without interrupting, the way he answered every hostile question from Oren without a trace of defensiveness, the way his hands remained perfectly still on the table even when the discussion grew tense. By the time the meeting ended, hours later, I had not found a single moment where Marcus Cole behaved the way the recordings had promised. He was not cruel. He was not proud. He was simply, unnervingly, honest, in a way that left me with far more questions than I had walked in with. As my guards escorted me back toward my quarters aboard the station, Kester finally broke the silence that had settled between us. "You seem troubled, Princess," he said. "I expected to meet a monster today," I told him, watching the corridor lights blur past as we walked. "Instead, I met a man who apologized for a war he did not start, and who spoke about his own grief more openly than any diplomat I have ever known. I do not know what frightens me more, Kestor, the version of him I was warned about, or the version I actually saw." Kestor said nothing for a long moment, his eyes still flicking toward the empty corridor behind us out of habit. "Perhaps both versions are true, Princess," he finally said. "Perhaps that is exactly why everyone remains so afraid of him." I did not answer, because I suspected he was right, and because some part of me had already begun to realize that understanding Marcus Cole would require far more than a single meeting in a borrowed room. It would require digging into the truth behind that recording, the truth my father had hinted at but never fully explained, the truth that seemed to exist somewhere between the monster the galaxy feared and the tired, grieving man who had asked, with complete sincerity, whether I was all right. That night, alone in my quarters, I found myself replaying not the recording of the battle, but the quiet moment when Marcus had stood the instant I entered the room, simply out of courtesy. 2 images of the same man, refusing to align, and I lay awake long into the artificial night of the station, certain that whatever answer I was looking for, I would not find it by staying safely on the surface of things any longer. Sleep never came that night, so by the time the station's artificial dawn cycle began brightening the corridors outside my quarters, I had already made my decision. If nobody would tell me the full truth about what happened during that battle, I would find it myself. I knew exactly who to ask for help. Iris had served my family for 11 years, a small companion droid originally assigned to manage palace archives, quiet and easily overlooked by everyone except the person she actually worked for. She arrived within minutes of my summons, her optical sensors dimmed low out of habit, the way she always kept them when moving through unfamiliar territory. "You look troubled, Princess," Iris said, her voice carrying the same gentle warmth it always had. Even now, hovering just inside a station meant to belong to no one. "I need access to the restricted war archives," I said, keeping my voice low. "Specifically, anything relating to the siege recorded 3 years ago, the one involving Sergeant Marcus Cole." Iris's sensors flickered, a small hesitation that told me more than words could have. "That archive carries the Emperor's personal seal, Princess," Iris said carefully. "Accessing it without his authorization would be considered a significant offense." "I am aware," I said. "I am also aware that my father has kept something from me, something important enough that even mentioning that battle changes the tone of every conversation around it. I need to understand what actually happened there, Iris. Not the version broadcast to the public, the truth." Iris remained still for a long moment, processing something I could not see, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped even lower than before. "There is a partition within the archive," she admitted. "One I was asked to secure personally, several years ago, before the war ended. I was told never to reveal its contents to anyone without direct authorization." "Who asked you to secure it?" "Your father, Princess." My chest tightened at that confirmation, though I had already suspected as much. Whatever waited inside that partition, my father had considered it dangerous enough to hide from his own daughter, dangerous enough to entrust only to a droid nobody would think to question. "Iris," I said carefully, choosing my words the way one might approach something fragile. "I am not asking you to betray my father. I am asking you to help me understand a decision that will shape the rest of my life. If there is something in that archive that changes how I should feel about this marriage, do you truly believe I should walk into it blind?" Iris's sensors brightened slightly, the closest expression of consideration her design allowed. "No, Princess," she said finally. "I do not believe that." It took nearly 2 hours to bypass the archive's outer security layers, working from a private terminal in my quarters, while my guards assumed I was simply resting after the long meeting the day before. Iris moved through the encrypted layers with careful precision, occasionally pausing to warn me that certain paths would trigger alerts if pursued too quickly. By the time the partition finally opened, the artificial morning outside had already shifted toward midday, and my hands were trembling slightly against the terminal's edge. The first files that appeared were nothing unusual: standard battle reports, casualty counts, strategic assessments filed by officers whose names meant nothing to me. But as Iris continued deeper into the partition, a folder appeared, labeled with a designation I recognized immediately. Prince Threll Vaoran, status, deceased. My breath caught in my throat. Threll had been my older brother, 12 years my senior, killed during the early years of the war, before I was old enough to fully understand what losing him meant. I had grown up with his memory carved into every corner of the palace: statues in the Eastern Garden, portraits in the Grand Hall, a national day of mourning observed every year on the anniversary of his death. His loss had shaped the entire tone of our war effort, a symbol used again and again to justify every escalation that followed. "Iris," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "why is my brother's file connected to this partition?" "I do not know, Princess," Iris said, and for the first time since I had known her, genuine uncertainty colored her voice. This connection was not something I was aware of when I secured the archive. I opened the file with trembling hands, and the first document that appeared was not a death certificate, as I had expected. It was a medical transfer record, dated 4 days after the official date of my brother's death, listing a patient recovered from the same siege site that had produced the recording my father showed me. The patient's identification had been redacted in the official record, replaced with a simple designation: survivor, transferred to neutral medical facility per rescuing officer's request. My hands shook so badly that Iris had to steady the terminal for me as I scrolled further, searching for anything that would explain the connection, anything that would tell me whether this survivor and my brother were truly the same person, or whether I was simply grasping at a coincidence born from desperate hope. The next document answered that question completely. It was a personal report, filed by Marcus Cole himself in the days following the siege, describing in plain, unembellished language exactly what had happened during those hours my father's recording had only shown in silence. I read every line twice, unable to fully process what I was seeing the first time through. The bunker had collapsed during the initial assault, trapping several soldiers from both sides beneath the rubble, my own empire's forces alongside the humans who had been sent to hold that position. Standard protocol, on either side of that war, dictated that trapped enemy combatants be left behind in situations where extraction risked the safety of one's own forces. Marcus's own commanding officers had given that exact order over the comm channel. Twice, according to his own written account. He had ignored it both times. The report described, in careful detail, how he had worked alone through the collapsed section of the bunker, first freeing his own wounded soldiers, then continuing into territory his superiors had explicitly told him to abandon, because he had heard voices beneath the wreckage that did not belong to his own side. Among those voices had been a young alien officer, barely more than a boy by our own standards, pinned beneath a support beam and unable to free himself. That officer's name, listed plainly in Marcus's own handwriting, was Threll Veoran. I sat back from the terminal, unable to breathe properly for several long moments, the weight of what I was reading settling over me like something physical. My brother had not died in that siege. He had been trapped, alongside enemy soldiers he had been raised to consider monsters, and it had been Marcus Cole, the very man my empire had spent years teaching me to fear, who had refused to leave him behind. "Iris," I said, my voice unsteady, "continue searching. I need to know why this was hidden." The next several documents painted a picture I had never once considered during all the years I had mourned my brother's public death. Threll had survived the siege, transferred quietly to a neutral medical facility under an assumed designation, and had remained there under careful secrecy for nearly a year while he recovered from injuries that had nearly ended his life. According to a final report, dated shortly before the war's official end, my father himself had visited that facility, spoken privately with the medical staff, and ultimately made the decision to maintain Threll's public status as deceased. I found the reasoning in a private correspondence buried 3 folders deep, a message from my father to his most trusted advisor, written in language far more honest than anything he had ever shared with me directly. If the Empire learns that a human soldier saved the life of our heir, after our own doctrine demanded he be abandoned, we lose more than a symbol. We lose the narrative that has held our people together through years of loss. Threll understands this. He has agreed to remain in seclusion until the political cost of the truth becomes survivable. Until then, his death must remain the version the people believe. I read that passage 3 times before the full weight of it settled fully into my chest. My father had sacrificed my brother's public existence, and by extension years of my own grief, to protect a narrative built entirely on hatred toward the very man he now intended me to marry. The propaganda that had shaped my entire understanding of humanity, The fear that had colored every conversation I'd ever had about Marcus Cole had been built in part to hide the fact that a human soldier had saved my own family's bloodline when our own doctrine demanded he let it end. "Where is Threll now?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Iris took a moment longer than usual to answer, and when she did, her voice carried something close to sympathy. "According to the most recent entry in this file, Princess, your brother currently resides at a private estate on the southern continent, under a protected identity. He has remained there for the past 2 years. My brother was alive. He had been alive this entire time, hidden away not to protect him from any remaining danger, but to protect a story my father had needed the Empire to believe. And the man responsible for keeping him alive in the first place, the man whose calm and quiet honesty I had spent the last day trying and failing to fully understand, had never once been given credit for what he'd done. Instead, he had been transformed into a symbol of everything we were taught to fear." I closed the terminal and sat in silence for a long time, trying to reconcile the two versions of the story that now existed in my mind. The recording my father had shown me, framed as a demonstration of terrifying human calm in the face of impossible odds, and the truth Marcus himself had written in his own careful hand, a story not of triumph but of one man refusing to let anyone die simply because the rules said he should stop trying. By the time I finally rose from the terminal, the artificial evening cycle had already begun dimming the corridor lights outside my quarters, and I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I found my father in the station's private observation deck, staring out at the slow drift of stars beyond the reinforced viewport, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he always adopted when something weighed heavily on his mind. "You knew," I said, before he had even turned to acknowledge my presence. "You knew Threll survived that siege. You knew a human soldier saved his life while your own commanders ordered him left behind, and instead of telling your people the truth, you built an entire narrative of fear around the very man responsible for keeping our family's bloodline alive." My father turned slowly, and I saw immediately that he was not surprised by my accusation, only weary, as though he had been waiting for this exact conversation since the moment he first told me about the arranged marriage. "I wondered how long it would take you to find that file," he said quietly. "You lied to me," I said, and my voice cracked despite every effort to keep it steady. "You let me mourn my own brother for years, Father. You let an entire empire build hatred toward humanity, partly to hide a truth that would have complicated the story you needed us to believe." "Yes," my father admitted, and there was no defensiveness in the word, only a tired, heavy honesty that mirrored something I had seen in Marcus's own expression the day before. "I made that choice, Seratathiel, and I have carried the weight of it every single day since." "Why?" I demanded. "Why hide something like this, when the truth might have ended the fear sooner, might have saved lives on both sides?" My father was quiet for a long moment, staring back out at the stars before answering. "Because fear held our empire together during the darkest years of that war," he said finally. "A story of monstrous enemies gave grieving families something to direct their pain toward. A story of a human soldier saving our heir against our own orders would have forced our people to question everything they believed about themselves, at the exact moment we could least afford that kind of doubt. I am not proud of the choice, Seratil, but I made it, and I would likely make it again, given the same circumstances." "And now?" I asked. "Now that the war is over, now that you intend to bind our family to the very man whose kindness you buried to protect a lie, do you intend to keep hiding it?" My father turned to face me fully, and something in his expression shifted, a decision settling into place behind his eyes. "No," he said. "The truth has already cost enough silence. It ends today." I did not fully believe him in that moment, not after everything I had just discovered, but something in the tired resolve of his voice told me this, at least, was not another calculated deception. Whatever came next, whatever the political cost of finally admitting the truth about Threll and about Marcus Cole, my father intended to face it rather than bury it any longer. I left the observation deck with more questions than I had walked in with, but one truth had settled clearly in my mind, undeniable now that I had read it in Marcus's own careful handwriting. The man I had been taught to fear above all others had, in the moment that mattered most, chosen compassion over doctrine, chosen my brother's life over the convenient rules of a war that told him not to bother. I did not yet know what to do with that truth. I only knew that everything I thought I understood about fear, about my father, and about the man I was meant to marry had just been rewritten in a single afternoon, and there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance I had carried before. I had not slept in nearly 2 full days by the time I asked to see Marcus Cole again, and I suspected he could tell simply by looking at me, though he was polite enough not to mention it. Before I recount that conversation, there is something else worth explaining first, something I only understood fully much later, when Marcus finally chose to speak plainly about the years that came before that siege. He told me this part of the story himself, and though I was not present for the events he described, I have chosen to share them exactly as he gave them to me, because I believe his own account explains more about him than anything I could have observed from the outside. By his own telling, the war with our empire had never truly felt like a war of conquest to Marcus, not in the way our propaganda always framed it. To him, and to the soldiers who served alongside him, it had felt like a long, exhausting argument about a single unbearable question. How much of yourself are you required to give up in exchange for staying alive? Our doctrine, drilled into every soldier from the earliest years of training, demanded calculation above all else. Preserve the greater number. Abandon the few when the odds turned unfavorable. It was not cruelty, not by our own understanding of the word, simply logic applied consistently, the same way any of our engineers might calculate the load limits of a bridge before deciding how much weight it could safely bear. Human doctrine, as far as Marcus explained it, never fully accepted that kind of math. Not because humans were incapable of understanding the numbers, but because something in how they were trained, or perhaps something deeper than training entirely, refused to let the numbers be the only thing that mattered. Marcus had lost people before that siege, more than he ever spoke about in detail, and by his own account, each loss had chipped away at something inside him that most people would call fear. Not the fear of dying himself, he explained, but the fear of failing the people who depended on him. Somewhere across years of watching friends die because the calculated odds said retreat was the only reasonable choice, he had made a private decision that no set of odds would ever again convince him to leave someone behind while there was still breath left in his body to try otherwise. That decision, more than any weapon or training, was what our own military analysts had mistaken for fearlessness. It was never fearlessness. It was simply a choice made once, and repeated so consistently afterward that it no longer required conscious thought, the same way a person does not consciously decide to breathe. When I finally sat across from him again, in a smaller, quieter room than our first meeting, I found myself studying him differently than before, searching not for the monster the recordings promised, nor even for the tired soldier I had met the day before, but for the man capable of the choice described in that report I had read. "You've been reading things you weren't supposed to read," Marcus said, before I had spoken a single word, and there was no accusation in his voice, only quiet observation. "How did you know?" I asked. "Your eyes," he said simply. "Yesterday you looked at me like you were trying to solve a puzzle. Today you look at me like you already found half the answer, and it scared you more than the puzzle did." I did not bother denying it. There seemed little point, given everything I had just learned. "I found the medical transfer record," I said quietly. "I know about my brother, Sergeant Cole. I know what you did during that siege, and I know what my father chose to hide about it afterward." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, not surprise exactly, more like the quiet settling of a weight he had been expecting to carry eventually. "I wondered if you'd find that eventually," he said. "I wasn't going to be the one to tell you, Princess. That wasn't my story to hand you. It belonged to your father, and to Threll himself, whenever they decided the timing was right." "You saved his life," I said. against direct orders. My own doctrine would have left him to die beneath that rubble, and your own commanding officers told you to do the exact same thing. Why didn't you listen to them?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped loosely around another cup of the same steaming drink he seemed to favor, though he did not drink from it this time. "He was 17, Marcus said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I heard him calling out beneath that wreckage, in a language I didn't fully understand at the time, and it didn't matter to me which side he was fighting for. I wasn't going to leave a 17-year-old to die alone in the dark, because a manual somewhere said his side had already lost that engagement. Even though it put your own life at greater risk, I asked, even though your own commanders explicitly ordered you not to. Especially because of that," Marcus said. "Princess, I think the thing your empire never quite understood about us, even after everything, is that we never measured our soldiers by how well they followed the math. We measured them by whether they came home able to look at themselves in a mirror. I wouldn't have been able to do that, knowing I left a kid to die, because pulling him out cost me something the numbers said wasn't worth spending." I sat with that answer for a long moment, turning it over in my mind, alongside everything I had read the night before, alongside the years of grief I had carried for a brother who had, in fact, been alive this entire time, hidden away not because of any remaining danger, but because the truth of his survival threatened a narrative my own father had needed the Empire to believe. "My father built an entire story around your cruelty," I said finally. "Fear of your people held our empire together during the worst years of that war, and the whole time, the truth was that you were the reason my brother survived at all." "I don't think your father is a bad man for that choice," Marcus said, surprising me. "I've made harder calls than that myself, Princess. Sometimes keeping people together matters more than the whole truth, at least for a little while. I'm not angry at him for it. I understand it better than you might expect." "How can you not be angry?" I asked, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. "He erased your kindness from history to make you into a monster instead. Doesn't that anger you even slightly?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, the same deliberate patience I had noticed in him from the very first moment we met. "It used to," he admitted, "early on, when I first learned how the story had been framed back on your side. I'll admit it stung more than I expected. But anger's expensive, Princess. It costs energy I'd rather spend somewhere else, somewhere that actually helps someone. Being angry at your father's choice wouldn't have brought your brother home any sooner, and it wouldn't have changed the story your people needed to believe at the time. So I let it go, mostly. Not because it didn't matter, but because holding on to it wouldn't have made anything better." I studied him for a long time after that, trying to reconcile this quiet, deliberate patience with the terrifying figure my empire had built its fears around for years. Both versions were true, I realized slowly. The man capable of ignoring 3 warships without flinching, and the man capable of setting aside his own justified anger because holding on to it served no one. Perhaps that combination, more than any weapon or tactic, was exactly what had made an entire galaxy afraid of what humanity represented. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said, after a long silence had settled between us. "Your brother reached out to me, about a year after the transfer, wanted to thank me properly, once he was strong enough to write it himself. We've kept in touch since then, quietly. He asked after you more than once." That small detail broke something loose in my chest that I had not expected, a tightness I had carried since childhood without ever fully naming it. My brother, alive and hidden away for years, had thought of me often enough to ask a human soldier, of all people, how I was doing. "Does he know about this marriage?" I asked quietly. "He does," Marcus said. "He wrote to me about it, actually, a few weeks before I arrived at this station." "What did he say?" Marcus allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile then, the first genuine one I had seen from him since we met. He said his little sister was more stubborn than an entire fleet of warships, and that if I somehow survived getting to know you properly, I'd have earned every bit of respect he already had for me. Something in my chest loosened at that, a small, unexpected warmth spreading through the tightness that had lived there since I first watched that terrible recording days ago. My brother, wherever he was hiding, still thought of me as stubborn, still held on to some piece of the sister he remembered, before the war had rearranged both of our lives so completely. "I would like to meet with him," I said. "Properly once this alliance is settled. I have grieved him for years believing he was gone. I would like the chance to know he is not, without the distance of secrecy standing between us any longer." "I think that can be arranged," Marcus said. "For what it's worth, Princess, I think he'd like that too." We sat together for a while longer after that, the conversation drifting into quieter, smaller topics, nothing as heavy as war, or grief, or secrets buried for years. He asked about the gardens I had grown up wandering as a child. I asked, hesitantly, about his own home, somewhere he described only briefly, a small town far from any capital, quiet in a way this entire negotiation had never once managed to be. By the time I finally rose to leave, something had shifted in how I viewed the man across the table from me, though I could not yet name exactly what that shift meant for the wedding still waiting ahead of us. I no longer feared him the way I had upon first learning of my father's decision. That fear had not vanished entirely, not completely, because there remained something undeniably formidable about a man capable of the calm I had witnessed in that recording. But it had changed shape, transformed from something cold and instinctive into something closer to awe, mixed uneasily with a grief I had only just begun to properly untangle. Whatever waited for me in the days ahead, I understood now that the man I had once called terrifying had never once tried to make me feel that way. Every ounce of fear surrounding him had been built by others, by propaganda, by grieving narratives constructed to hold an empire together during its darkest years, rather than by anything Marcus Cole himself had ever done or said. That distinction mattered more than I had expected it to, and as I walked back toward my quarters through the quiet corridors of the neutral station, I found myself, for the first time since this entire arrangement began, thinking less about the fear my father had warned me to understand, and more about the brother I would finally get to see again, and the strange, quiet man whose kindness had made that reunion possible in the first place. The ceremony hall aboard the neutral station had been transformed overnight, its plain metal walls draped in banners bearing both the crest of our empire and the simple emblem of the human alliance, and I stood behind a curtain at the far end of the room, listening to the murmur of gathered dignitaries on the other side, my heart pounding harder than it had during any of the conversations that led me here. Kestor stood beside me, adjusting the ceremonial fabric draped across my shoulders with careful, practiced hands, though I noticed his own attention kept drifting toward the gap in the curtain, watching the room beyond with the same wary habit he had carried since the moment we first arrived at this station. "You seem calmer than I expected, Princess," he said quietly. "I am not calm," I admitted. "I am simply no longer afraid of the same things I was afraid of a few days ago." Kestor considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod, as though it made perfect sense to him. "Your father is waiting to speak with the assembly before the ceremony begins," he said. "He asked that I bring you to the side entrance once he has finished." I nodded, and a few moments later, the murmur beyond the curtain quieted as my father's voice rose to address the gathered representatives from both empires. I could not see him from where I stood, but I could hear every word clearly through the thin fabric separating us, and what he said next was not the speech I had expected. "Before this alliance is sealed," my father began, his voice carrying the same steady authority it always did, though something in its tone felt different than usual, heavier, more honest. "There is a truth I have carried for several years, one I believe this gathering deserves to hear before we proceed any further." I felt Kestor stiffen slightly beside me, clearly as surprised by this unplanned addition as I was. "3 years ago," my father continued, "during the siege that has since become infamous across both our peoples, my son, Prince Threl Ve Orin, was trapped beneath collapsed wreckage alongside soldiers from both sides of that conflict. Official doctrine, on our side, demanded that stranded personnel be abandoned when extraction risked further losses. That same doctrine existed in different form, within the human command structure as well. A murmur rippled through the assembly, confusion and unease audible even through the curtain. "My son did not die that day," my father said, and the murmur sharpened into something closer to shock. "He survived, rescued by a human soldier who ignored his own commanding officer's direct orders to leave him behind. I made the choice, in the difficult years that followed, to maintain the story of his death rather than reveal the truth of his survival, believing our people needed a symbol of loss to hold together through the hardest years of that war. I was wrong to make that choice alone, and I have decided the truth can no longer remain buried, not on the day my daughter takes her place beside the very man who made that survival possible." The silence that followed felt heavier than any I had experienced during the tense negotiations of the past several days. I could not see the faces of the assembly, but I could imagine them clearly enough, the shock rippling through representatives from both empires, as the foundation of a story they had believed for years quietly shifted beneath them. "Sergeant Marcus Cole," my father continued, "has been named across our systems as a symbol of everything we once feared about humanity. Today I stand before this assembly to correct that record. He is, instead, the reason my family's bloodline continues at all, and the reason I now believe this alliance represents not merely a treaty between wary strangers, but a genuine chance for two peoples to understand each other properly, rather than through the distorted lens of wartime fear." When the curtain finally parted and I stepped into the hall, the assembly was still absorbing the weight of what my father had just revealed, and for a brief, strange moment, every eye in the room seemed to shift between me, my father, and the quiet figure standing near the front of the gathering, dressed simply, without a single decoration marking his uniform, exactly as he had been every time I had seen him before. Marcus met my eyes as I walked the length of the hall, and I saw none of the calm detachment the recordings had promised, none of the calculated stillness my empire had spent years fearing. I saw instead something far simpler, a quiet steadiness that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with a man who had simply decided, somewhere along the difficult path of his own life, that fear no longer served him the way it once might have served someone else. When I reached him, he offered his hand, not with ceremony, but with the same simple courtesy he had shown me in our very first meeting, and I took it without hesitation, feeling none of the terror that image on that screen had once promised me I would feel. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal words and careful traditions blended awkwardly between two cultures that had spent years trying to destroy each other, but the moment that remained clearest in my memory afterward was not the exchange of vows, nor the formal sealing of the alliance between our peoples. It was the moment, near the end of the gathering, when Marcus was invited to speak before the assembled representatives, and instead of the triumphant speech many in that room clearly expected, he offered something far quieter. "I know most of you have heard stories about what I did during that siege," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its quiet, measured tone. "I know some of those stories made me sound like something worth fearing. I'd like to offer a different version, if you'll allow it." The hall remained silent, waiting. "I didn't win that engagement because I was fearless," Marcus continued. "I won it because I refused to leave people behind, on either side of that conflict, and because I was lucky enough to survive doing something that could easily have gotten me killed instead. There's no strategy in that worth studying, no doctrine worth teaching to future soldiers. There's just a simple choice, made in a bad moment, that happened to work out. I'd rather be remembered for that choice than for the fear it apparently caused afterward." I watched the assembled dignitaries as he spoke, noticing the same unease flicker across many of their faces that I had felt myself during our very first meeting, the discomfort of realizing that the monster they had built in their minds simply did not exist in the man standing before them. It occurred to me, watching that unease ripple through the room, that this quiet honesty unsettled them more deeply than any display of strength or aggression ever could have. A monster could be studied, predicted, eventually understood well enough to counter. A man who genuinely meant every word of humble sincerity he spoke, offered nothing for fear to grab hold of at all. After the ceremony concluded, As the gathered representatives began filtering slowly toward the reception hall prepared elsewhere on the station, my father found me standing near a viewport overlooking the slow drift of stars beyond the reinforced glass, Marcus a comfortable distance away, speaking quietly with Ambassador Henry Ashcroft near the far wall. "I owe you an apology, Saratil," my father said quietly, coming to stand beside me, "for the years of silence about Threll, and for the fear I allowed to shape so much of your understanding about the man you married today." "You believed you were protecting something important," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "I do not fully forgive the years of grief that silence cost me, Father, but I understand the reasoning behind it, far better now than I did a few days ago." "Your brother has requested permission to attend the reception privately," my father said, and something in his voice carried a careful hope I had rarely heard from him before. "If you are willing to receive him." My chest tightened with an entirely different kind of emotion than the fear that had carried me through the past several days, something closer to the aching hope of a wound finally being allowed to heal properly. "Yes," I said immediately. "Father, yes, of course." Later that evening, in a quiet side chamber away from the noise of the larger reception, I finally stood face to face with a brother I had mourned for years, his face older than I remembered, marked faintly with scars from injuries that had nearly ended his life, but unmistakably, wonderfully alive. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, simply staring at each other across a distance that had once felt permanent, and when he finally stepped forward and embraced me, I felt years of carefully buried grief finally begin to loosen its grip on my chest. "I heard you gave Father quite a difficult time about this marriage," Threll said, pulling back slightly, a familiar teasing warmth in his voice that I had not heard directed at me since childhood. "I was terrified," I admitted. "Everyone told me to fear him." "And now?" Threll asked. I glanced across the room, toward where Marcus stood near the entrance, quietly declining a second offer of the ceremonial toast being passed among the guests, the same tired patience in his posture that I had noticed from our very first meeting. "Now I understand that everyone was afraid of the wrong thing," I said. "They feared his calm, when they should have marveled at what caused it." Threll followed my gaze, his expression softening as it settled on the man who had once ignored his own commanding officer's direct orders to keep a stranded 17-year-old prince from dying alone beneath a collapsed bunker. "He never once let me thank him properly," Threll said quietly. "Every time I tried, he changed the subject to something else. I think he genuinely doesn't believe he deserves the credit." "I think that is exactly why he deserves it more than anyone else," I said. As the reception continued late into the artificial evening cycle of the station, I found myself standing eventually beside Marcus near the same viewport where I had spoken with my father earlier, both of us quiet for a while, watching the distant light of stars belonging to neither of our empires exclusively. "You seem different than you did when I first saw you," Marcus said finally, "less frightened." "I am less frightened," I admitted, "though I suspect the galaxy beyond this station remains just as afraid of you as it ever was." Marcus allowed himself a small, tired smile at that, glancing briefly toward the assembled representatives still murmuring uneasily among themselves near the far end of the hall, clearly still absorbing the truth my father had revealed earlier that day. "Let them be afraid," he said quietly, "as long as the people who actually matter to me understand the truth of it. That's always been enough for me." I considered that for a long moment, thinking back over everything I had learned in the handful of days since I first watched that terrible recording in my father's throne room, back before I understood anything real about the man standing beside me now. "I came to this station terrified of a human warrior," I said finally, watching the stars drift slowly past the viewport. "I am leaving it married to the only person in this galaxy who never once tried to make me feel that way." Marcus turned to look at me then, something quiet and genuine settling into his tired eyes, and for the first time since this entire journey began, I felt no trace of the fear that had once defined every thought I carried about him. Elsewhere across the galaxy, In the quiet chambers of distant empires who had not yet learned the truth my father revealed that day, whispers were already beginning to spread about the human alliance and the strange, unsettling calm of the soldiers who had somehow ended a war nobody expected them to survive. They would spend years trying to understand what truly made humanity so difficult to predict, searching for weapons, strategies, doctrines capable of explaining it. They would never find the answer in any of those places, because the true weapon had never been violence at all. It had simply been a stubborn, unshakable loyalty that refused to calculate away the people who mattered most. A loyalty no empire built on careful odds and convenient doctrine had ever learned to properly measure, and one that, standing quietly beside my husband, beneath the drifting stars of a station belonging to neither of our worlds, I finally understood completely.